The F-22 pilot's hands stopped moving. His voice shook on the radio. Wait. Ghost is on that plane. The woman they just stopped wore cheap old clothes and sat in a middle seat. Nobody knew this simple passenger had shot down more enemy jets than any pilot alive. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning sun cast long shadows across Denver International Airport as passengers shuffled through the boarding gate for United Flight 227 to Washington Dulles. Among them moved a woman in her late 40s whose appearance inspired no second glances. She wore faded jeans, a plain gray sweater that had seen better days, and carried a worn canvas duffel bag that looked like it had survived a dozen garage sales. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup adorned her face, and her scuffed hiking boots suggested someone more comfortable on mountain trails than in airport terminals. She moved with quiet efficiency through the gate check, presenting her boarding pass to the agent who barely looked up before waving her through with the practiced indifference reserved for economy passengers. As she made her way down the narrow aisle of the Boeing 757, other passengers were already settling into their seats with the territorial urgency of frequent travelers. She found her seat in row 23, a middle seat naturally, wedged between a businessman already absorbed in his laptop and a young mother wrestling with a toddler and an overstuffed diaper bag. The woman stowed her duffel in the overhead compartment with practiced ease, though the motion revealed a certain controlled strength that went unnoticed by those around her. She settled into her seat, fastened her seatbelt, and pulled a paperback mystery novel from her bag, the kind with a lurid cover purchased from a supermarket spinner rack. The flight attendant making her pre-flight rounds paused at their row with the bright smile that came from years of customer service training. "Can I help you find anything, ma'am?" she asked, her tone carrying that particular mixture of politeness and subtle condescension often directed at passengers who appeared less sophisticated. The woman in the middle seat simply shook her head with a quiet, "No, thank you," her voice soft and unremarkable. The flight attendant moved on, already forgetting the encounter before she reached the next row. The businessman to her left glanced over briefly, taking in her worn appearance and discount store novel before dismissing her entirely, returning his attention to what appeared to be financial projections on his screen. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, the passengers settled into the familiar rhythms of air travel. The young mother beside her struggled with her fussy toddler, and the woman in the middle seat quietly offered a worn stuffed animal from her bag. "My nephew loved this one," she said simply, her voice still soft and unassuming. The mother accepted with surprised gratitude, noting the kindness but also making quick assumptions about this simple woman who probably had a large extended family, likely worked in childcare or some similar service occupation, someone content with life's simpler pleasures and modest means. Behind them, two corporate executives in first-class suits were deep in conversation about military contracts and defense appropriations, their voices carrying over the seats as they discussed billion-dollar fighter programs and next-generation weapons systems with the casual authority of people who'd never been closer to combat than a Pentagon briefing room. The F-22 program was a waste, one declared confidently. Overcomplicated, over-budget, and they barely see any action. "Give me the old F-15s any day." His companion agreed enthusiastically, both men secure in their expertise gleaned from industry conferences and consultant reports. The woman in row 23 never looked up from her paperback novel, though the corner of her mouth might have twitched almost imperceptibly. She turned a page with fingers that bore no rings, no nail polish, nothing to distinguish them except perhaps a certain callous strength that suggested years of physical work. The businessman beside her shifted in his seat, accidentally bumping her arm, and muttered an apology that was more reflex than genuine acknowledgement, his eyes never leaving his screen where he was reviewing acquisition strategies for his firm's latest venture into aerospace manufacturing. United Flight 227 reached its assigned position and received clearance for takeoff. The engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, and the aircraft accelerated down runway 16R, lifting smoothly into the clear Colorado morning. The woman in 23B felt the familiar sensation of wheels leaving concrete, the subtle change in vibration and sound that came with flight, and something in her posture relaxed almost imperceptibly. She was home in a way that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with being airborne. 2 hours into the flight, as the Boeing 757 cruised at 37,000 feet over Kansas, the woman had finished her mystery novel and closed her eyes, appearing to doze. Around her, the cabin had settled into that peculiar torpor of mid-flight, passengers lost in screens, books, or sleep. The flight attendants had completed their beverage service and retreated to their jump seats. The pilots were managing the autopilot with the relaxed attention of a routine flight, and nothing suggested that the next hour would transform into something that would be analyzed in military academies and aviation safety courses for decades to come. The first indication of trouble came not from within the aircraft but from hundreds of miles away, where air defense radar operators at NORAD's Operations Center in Colorado Springs were tracking an anomaly. A civilian aircraft had deviated from its filed flight plan without communication, and its transponder signal had become erratic. Standard protocols were initiated immediately. Attempts to raise the flight crew on multiple frequencies went unanswered. The aircraft's course was trending toward restricted airspace over classified military installations in central Kansas, and the timeline for intercept was compressing rapidly. Major Jack "Razor" Morrison was sitting in the alert facility at Whiteman Air Force Base when the klaxon sounded. He'd been playing cards with his wingman, Captain Sarah "Viper" Chen, both of them in full flight gear as required for their alert status. The scramble order came through with stark clarity: unknown aircraft, possible hijacking, intercept and identify. Within 90 seconds, both pilots were strapping into their F-22 Raptors, the most advanced air superiority fighters ever built, aircraft so sophisticated that their very existence had redefined what was possible in aerial combat. Morrison ran through his pre-flight checks with the automatic precision that came from thousands of hours in fighter cockpits. The F-22 around him was a marvel of engineering, its angular stealth design making it nearly invisible to radar, its engines capable of supercruise speeds exceeding Mach 1.5 without afterburners, its avionics suite providing situational awareness that bordered on prescient. He'd been flying Raptors for 7 years, had logged combat missions over 3 continents, and wore the patch of an aggressor squadron that had never lost an engagement in training exercises. He was, by any measure, among the elite of military aviation. "Razor, Viper, you're cleared for immediate departure," the tower controller's voice crackled through his helmet. "Vector 090, climb to flight level 400, contact Huntress on button 7 for tactical control." "Razor copies," Morrison acknowledged, advancing his throttles. The F-22's Pratt & Whitney engines responded with a roar that shook the hardened shelter, and he rolled onto the taxiway with Viper falling into formation behind him. Within 3 minutes of the initial scramble order, both Raptors were airborne, climbing through the morning sky in full afterburner, their exhaust trails marking 2 perfect lines across the blue expanse. Aboard United 227, the passengers remained blissfully unaware that 2 of the world's most lethal aircraft were rocketing toward them at supersonic speed. The woman in 23B had opened her eyes and was gazing out the small window at the landscape far below, her expression peaceful and unremarkable. The businessman beside her had finally closed his laptop and was reviewing a printed report, occasionally making notes in the margins with a gold pen that probably cost more than her entire outfit. In the cockpit of Flight 227, Captain Robert Hayes and First Officer Jennifer Martinez were dealing with a crisis that had escalated from annoying to potentially catastrophic in the space of 10 minutes. Their primary radio had failed completely, a backup system was providing only intermittent functionality, and their transponder was displaying error codes that made no sense according to any troubleshooting protocol in their manuals. Hayes, a 30-year veteran with over 20,000 flight hours, had never encountered a cascading electronics failure of this magnitude. Every attempt to communicate with air traffic control resulted in static or silence. "Try the emergency frequency again," Hayes instructed, his voice tight with controlled tension. Martinez complied, keying the microphone and broadcasting blind on 121.5 MHz, the Universal Aviation Distress Frequency. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday, United 227 experiencing complete communications failure, requesting assistance." Only static answered. Unknown to them, their transmission was being received, but their receiver had failed completely, leaving them broadcasting into the void without any ability to hear responses. Morrison and Chen reached their assigned altitude and contacted the AWACS controller managing the intercept. Huntress, Razor Flight of 2, checking in as fragged, Morrison transmitted, his voice professionally calm despite the adrenaline singing through his system. The E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft orbiting over Nebraska had the complete tactical picture displayed across its radar screens, and the controller's response was immediate and urgent. Razor, Huntress has you radar contact. Your target is United 227, Boeing 757, squawking emergency codes, no radio contact established. Course 300, altitude 37,000, airspeed 480 knots. Intercept and identify, rules of engagement per SONAR protocols, authenticate Hotel Bravo. Morrison's blood chilled slightly at the authentication code, which confirmed this was a potential hostile situation requiring readiness to employ weapons if necessary. Razor authenticates Hotel Bravo, proceeding to intercept. He checked his tactical display, which showed the target aircraft as a steady blue symbol 30 miles ahead and slightly below. Viper, take combat spread, we're going in. The two F-22s separated laterally, establishing a formation that would allow them to approach the target from multiple angles while maintaining mutual support. Morrison armed his weapons systems, feeling the familiar sequence of switches and confirmations that readied his Raptor for combat. He carried a full air-to-air loadout, AIM-120 AMRA missiles for beyond visual range engagements and AIM-9X Sidewinders for close-in fighting, plus his internal M61 Vulcan cannon with 480 rounds of 20mm ammunition. He desperately hoped he wouldn't need any of it, but hope was not a tactical plan. Tally target, Viper called, her eyes having picked out the distant glint of sunlight reflecting off aluminum skin. Morrison acquired the visual contact a moment later, and both Raptors accelerated to close the distance. The intercept geometry was textbook perfect, bringing them up alongside the Boeing 757 from behind and below, rising into formation where they would be clearly visible to the cockpit crew. Captain Hayes caught the motion in his peripheral vision and turned to see the angular, predatory shape of an F-22 Raptor rising into position off his left wing, so close he could see the pilot's helmet and the weapons bay doors on the fighter's belly. His stomach dropped. Fighter intercepts of civilian aircraft meant one thing: someone on the ground believed his aircraft posed a threat. Jesus Christ, he breathed. Martinez followed his gaze and her face went pale. Morrison stabilized in formation 50 feet from the 757's cockpit, close enough to make direct eye contact with the airline captain. He could see the shock on the man's face, the sudden understanding that something had gone terribly wrong. Morrison raised his left hand where Hayes could see it and made the universal signal for radio failure, a cutting motion across his throat followed by pointing to his helmet. Hayes nodded vigorously and immediately had Martinez searching for alternative communication methods. Huntress, Razor has visual contact with United 227, Morrison transmitted. Cockpit crew appears responsive and aware. I've signaled possible radio failure. Aircraft appears under control, no visible damage, no apparent hostile action. Even as he spoke, he was conducting a detailed visual inspection of the airliner, looking for anything unusual, damaged control surfaces, signs of explosive decompression, suspicious modifications, anything that might indicate this was something other than a routine mechanical emergency. Aboard Flight 227, the first passengers to notice the fighter escort were those with window seats on the left side. A teenage boy 3 rows behind the woman in 23B suddenly pressed his face to the window and gasped. "Mom! Mom, there's a fighter jet right outside." His exclamation carried through the cabin, and suddenly dozens of passengers were craning for a view, voices rising in excitement and confusion and, for some, dawning fear. The woman in 23B didn't need to look. She'd felt the subtle change in air pressure as the F-22 took up formation, had recognized the shadow that briefly flickered across her window, and knew exactly what was happening. Her expression didn't change, but her hands tightened slightly on the armrests, and her mind began running through tactical assessments with the automatic precision of someone who'd spent 2 decades making life-and-death decisions in aerial combat environments. The businessman beside her finally looked up from his report, drawn by the commotion. He leaned across her to peer out the window, his expensive cologne washing over her as he pressed close without asking permission. "Holy shit," he muttered. "That's an F-22. Why would His voice trailed off as understanding dawned. Oh God, do they think we're hijacked? The cabin erupted into controlled chaos. Passengers pulled out phones to take pictures despite the flight attendant's immediate commands to put them away. Parents clutched children close. The two defense contractors who'd been holding forth about fighter programs earlier were now silent, their faces pressed to windows, all their theoretical knowledge suddenly confronted with the reality of a combat aircraft armed and ready mere feet from their seats. The lead flight attendant, a veteran named Patricia Reeves, keyed the interphone to contact the cockpit. Captain, passengers are reporting military aircraft in formation with us. What's our situation? Her voice was admirably steady, though her hands shook slightly as she gripped the handset. Hayes responded immediately. Patricia, we've experienced a complete radio failure and have been intercepted according to standard protocols. We're working on establishing communication with the fighter escort. Keep the passengers calm, this is a safety precaution, nothing more. He hoped he was telling the truth. Morrison was running through alternative communication methods. With the 757 unable to receive radio transmissions, he needed another way to pass instructions. He pulled out his knee board and wrote in large block letters on a blank card, "Follow me to nearest airport." He held the card up to his canopy where Hayes could see it clearly, then pointed forward emphatically. Hayes nodded understanding, but his face showed conflict. Without working radios, he couldn't inform air traffic control of a diversion. Flying off his filed flight plan could cause even more confusion and potentially trigger additional military response. But the fighter pilot's instructions were clear, and Hayes understood the implicit threat: comply or face escalation. He made a decision and began a gentle turn to follow whatever heading the F-22 would provide. Huntress, Razor has established visual communication, Morrison reported. Target is complying with instructions to divert. Request nearest suitable airport for emergency landing, full emergency services standing by. The AWACS controller consulted with ground-based coordination centers. Razor, recommended divert is Wichita Eisenhower, runway 19er left, 11 miles at your 2 o'clock position. Field has been notified, emergency services are rolling. Morrison waggled his wings to get Hayes' attention and began a gentle lead turn toward Wichita. The 757 followed, and Viper maintained her position on the airliner's opposite wing, bracketing the commercial jet between two of the most advanced fighters ever built. The formation descended through layers of cumulus clouds, 3 aircraft now bound together in an emergency that would require perfect coordination to resolve safely. In the cabin of Flight 227, passengers watched the prairie landscape rising to meet them, the city of Wichita growing larger through the windows. The woman in 23B remained calm, her breathing steady and controlled. She'd been in far more dangerous situations, had flown combat missions where enemy fighters were actively trying to kill her, had made emergency landings with aircraft so damaged they should never have stayed airborne. This was serious, but it was manageable, and she trusted that the pilots, both military and civilian, knew their jobs. The teenager who'd first spotted the fighters was now filming everything on his phone, narrating breathlessly for what would inevitably become a viral social media post. We're being escorted by F-22s. We're landing in Wichita. This is insane. His mother tried to quiet him, but her own fear made her attempts half-hearted. Morrison guided the 757 through the approach pattern, using hand signals and radio calls that he knew the airline captain couldn't hear but which would be recorded for later analysis. Huntress, Razor flight is at 5 miles, 3 aircraft in formation, commencing final approach. On the ground at Wichita Eisenhower, every emergency vehicle the airport possessed was positioned along the runway. Fire trucks, ambulances, law enforcement vehicles from multiple jurisdictions, and FBI agents who'd scrambled from the local field office all watched the sky. The airport had been cleared, all other traffic diverted or held, and the entire facility had gone into lockdown mode. No one knew if this was a simple radio failure or something far more sinister. Captain Hayes flew the approach manually, every bit of his experience focused on making this landing smooth and professional despite the extraordinary circumstances. He called out altitudes to Martinez, who was backing him up on every step, and the 757 descended on a perfect 3-degree glide slope. The F-22s stayed in formation until the last possible moment, then peeled away in a beautiful crossed brake maneuver, pulling up and away as the airliner's main gear touched concrete. The landing was smooth, almost gentle, and Hayes immediately deployed thrust reversers and heavy braking. The 757 slowed rapidly, and he followed the guidance of ground vehicles toward a remote parking area well away from the terminal. As the aircraft came to a stop, emergency vehicles swarmed around it, and Hayes finally shut down the engines. He looked at Martinez, and they shared a moment of profound relief. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes announced over the public address system, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who just navigated a crisis. "We've landed safely in Wichita due to a communications equipment failure. You'll notice emergency services surrounding the aircraft. This is standard protocol. Please remain seated and calm. We'll have more information shortly." Morrison and Chen had climbed back to altitude and were orbiting overhead, watching the ground response unfold. "Razor, Huntress, good intercept and safe return of the aircraft. Stand by for further instructions." "Razor copies," Morrison acknowledged. He felt the adrenaline beginning to ebb, replaced by the familiar post-mission weariness. It had been a textbook intercept, exactly the kind of response that prevented catastrophic incidents, even if this particular case seemed to be nothing more than a mechanical failure. Still, procedures existed for good reasons, and he'd followed them perfectly. On the ground, FBI agents were boarding the aircraft from mobile stairs, beginning the process of interviewing crew and passengers. The lead agent, Special Agent Marcus Holloway, had been briefed that this appeared to be a legitimate emergency rather than a security threat, but protocols demanded thorough investigation. He stood at the front of the cabin and addressed the passengers. "I'm Special Agent Holloway with the FBI. I know this has been a frightening experience, but I need everyone to remain calm and patient. We'll be conducting brief interviews with each of you, collecting identification, and then arranging ground transportation to your destinations. Please have your IDs ready and wait for an agent to call you forward." The process began methodically, agents working through the cabin row by row. Passengers provided identification, gave quick statements about when they'd noticed the emergency, whether they'd seen anything suspicious, and answered questions about their travel plans. Most interviews took less than 5 minutes. The woman in 23B waited patiently as the agents worked their way backward through the cabin, her expression unchanging. When Special Agent Holloway reached row 23, he barely glanced at her before addressing the businessmen. After collecting his information, Holloway turned to the woman with the same routine efficiency. "ID please, ma'am," he requested, his notepad ready. She reached into her worn canvas bag and withdrew a wallet, extracting what appeared to be a standard driver's license. She handed it to Holloway without comment. He glanced down at it, beginning to copy the information onto his notepad, and then froze. His eyes widened fractionally, and he looked up at her face, then back down at the ID, then at her face again. His mouth opened slightly, and for a moment, he seemed to have forgotten how to speak. "Ma'am," he finally managed, his voice dropping to a tone of profound respect that made several nearby passengers turn to look. "Ma'am, Could you wait here for just one moment please?" He backed away, still staring at her, and moved quickly to the front of the cabin where he pulled aside his supervisor, Special Agent Patricia Brooks. They had a brief, intense conversation conducted in urgent whispers, Holloway showing Brooks the ID he'd been given. Brooks's reaction was nearly identical to Holloway's: shock, disbelief, and then something approaching awe. She immediately pulled out her phone and made a call, speaking rapidly to someone in authority. The conversation lasted less than a minute, and when she ended the call, she stood for a moment collecting herself before walking back down the aisle. The woman in 23B watched their approach with the same calm expression she'd maintained throughout the flight. Brooks stopped at her row and spoke with a deference that was unmistakable to everyone within earshot. "Ma'am, would you be willing to come with me to a private area? We'd like to discuss the situation with you if you're willing." "Of course," the woman replied quietly, standing with easy grace and retrieving her duffel bag. The businessman beside her and the young mother on the aisle were both staring now, their assumptions about this simple, plainly dressed woman suddenly crumbling in the face of whatever reaction she provoked in the FBI agents. Brooks led her to a private room in the airport terminal that had been commandeered as a temporary command center. Inside were representatives from multiple agencies, FBI, TSA, FAA, and a military liaison officer from Whiteman Air Force Base. Brooks handed the driver's license to the military liaison, a lieutenant colonel named David Chen, who took one look and stood abruptly to attention. "Colonel," he said, addressing the woman directly. "Colonel, I had no idea you were aboard that aircraft. I apologize for any." She raised a hand gently. "No apology necessary, Colonel." The response was appropriate and professional. "I'd have been disappointed with anything less." Special Agent Brooks was looking between them in confusion. "I'm sorry, but I need to understand what's happening here. The ID says her name is Colonel Rebecca Kane," Lieutenant Colonel Chen supplied. "Call sign Ghost." "Colonel, perhaps you should explain, since they clearly don't have the security clearances for most of your service record." Colonel Rebecca Kane, who'd spent the last 3 hours being ignored and subtly condescended to by passengers who assumed she was a simple woman of no particular importance, finally allowed the slightest smile to cross her face. "I'm retired now," she said simply. 23 years of service, most of it classified. I was a fighter pilot, among other things." "Among other things," Chen repeated with something approaching a laugh. "Colonel Kane doesn't just fly fighters. She was the first woman to qualify on the F-22 Raptor. She has more combat missions in the Raptor than any pilot alive. She commanded the 27th Fighter Squadron, flew operations over Syria, Iraq, and classified theaters, and has been credited with 9 confirmed aerial victories, making her the first American female fighter ace since World War II, though most of those victories remain classified to protect sources and methods." Brooks's mouth fell open. The other agents in the room were similarly stunned. Kane simply shrugged. "I was good at my job," she said with characteristic understatement. "The F-22 is an exceptional aircraft, and I was fortunate to serve with exceptional people." Lieutenant Colonel Chen was pulling up information on a secure tablet. "Colonel, I'm afraid there's more. The F-22 pilots who intercepted your flight." He paused, checking the names. "Major Jack Morrison, callsign Razor, and Captain Sarah Chin, callsign Viper. They're still on station overhead. I think they need to know who was aboard that aircraft. With your permission, I'd like to inform them." Kane considered for a moment, then nodded. "Go ahead. But keep it professional. No fuss." Chen picked up a radio handset connected to the military frequency. "Huntress, Whiteman Liaison, requesting patch to Razor flight for priority communication." Morrison, still orbiting overhead with Viper, heard the call and responded immediately. "Huntress, Razor, send traffic." "Razor, Whiteman Liaison," Chen transmitted. "We've completed initial processing of passengers from United 227. I need to inform you of a special passenger who was aboard that aircraft." He paused, considering how to phrase what came next. "Razor, the passenger manifest included a Colonel Rebecca Kane, retired. Callsign Ghost. I'm transmitting her service photo to your data link now." There was absolute silence on the frequency. Morrison's hands froze on his flight controls. Beside him in the formation, Viper's F-22 wobbled slightly as she jerked in surprise. Both pilots' tactical displays populated with a service photograph, a woman in her flight suit standing in front of an F-22, helmet tucked under her arm, her expression confident and professional, the name tape reading came. "Say again." Morrison finally managed, his voice tight with disbelief. "Razor, you just intercepted an aircraft carrying Colonel Rebecca Kane. Ghost. She was traveling as a civilian passenger." Morrison felt like he'd been punched in the chest. Every fighter pilot in the United States Air Force knew that call sign. Ghost was a legend, a pilot whose achievements in the F-22 program had become the stuff of myth. Stories about her were told in ready rooms and pilot bars around the world, the engagement over Syria where she'd shot down 2 Russian-made Su-35s in a single mission, the classified operation where she'd penetrated the most sophisticated air defense network ever deployed and emerged without a scratch, the training exercises where she'd wiped out entire aggressor squadrons without them ever detecting her presence. Jesus, Viper breathed over their discreet frequency. We just intercepted Ghost. Morrison's mind was reeling. He'd joined the F-22 program 4 years after Kane had retired, but her influence was everywhere. Her tactical innovations were still being taught, her combat reports were still being studied, and her name was spoken with reverence by pilots who considered themselves elite. She'd proven that a woman could not only compete but dominate in the most demanding fighter aircraft ever built, and she'd done it with a humility and professionalism that made her accomplishments even more remarkable. Whiteman Liaison, Razor, Morrison transmitted, his voice steadier now. Is Colonel Kane available for communication? In the command center, Chen looked at Kane questioningly. She hesitated, then nodded and accepted the handset he offered. Razor Flight, this is Ghost, she said, using her old call sign naturally despite the years of retirement. Her voice over the radio carried an authority that required no rank or title to establish. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. That voice, calm and professional and utterly confident, belonged to someone who'd done things in an F-22 that he could only aspire to accomplish. Ghost, Razor. Ma'am, we had no idea. The intercept was perfect, Major, Kane interrupted gently. Textbook procedures, professional execution, exactly what the situation required. You and Captain Chen did outstanding work today. Viper came on the frequency, her voice carrying an excitement she couldn't quite suppress. Ma'am, I've read all your after-action reports that aren't classified. The engagement over Raqqa, the defensive counter-air mission in 21. You're the reason I wanted to fly Raptors. Kane's smile was audible in her voice. Then you've made me very proud, Captain. The F-22 community needs pilots like you. Keep up the good work, and maybe someday someone will be saying the same thing about you. There was a pause, and then Morrison spoke again, his voice carrying profound respect. Ghost, Razor. It was an honor to share the sky with you today, even under these circumstances. If you're ever around Whiteman, the 442nd Fighter Wing would be honored to host you. I'll keep that in mind, Razor. Safe flying. Kane handed the radio back to Chen, her expression thoughtful. For a few moments, she'd been Ghost again, speaking the language of fighter pilots, inhabiting that world of high-speed tactics and split-second decisions that had been her life for so long. Back aboard the 757, the remaining passengers were being processed and learning in fragments about the extraordinary person who'd been sitting among them in complete anonymity. The businessman from 23A was talking rapidly to anyone who would listen, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by embarrassed wonder. She was right next to me. I had no idea. Do you know what she's done? The defense contractors who'd been criticizing the F-22 program looked physically ill as they learned that one of the aircraft's most accomplished pilots had been sitting behind them, listening to their ignorant pronouncements in silence. The young mother from 23C was holding her toddler and the warm stuffed animal that Kane had given them, suddenly understanding that the simple kindness had come from someone of extraordinary accomplishment who'd never felt the need to mention it. The news spread through the terminal as passengers were released and began sharing their experience on social media. Within an hour, the story was trending nationwide. Journalists were descending on Wichita Eisenhower. The Pentagon was preparing statements. Colonel Kane herself slipped out of the command center through a side door, declining interviews, avoiding cameras, and making her way to a rental car counter with the same quiet efficiency she'd displayed throughout the entire ordeal. At Whiteman Air Force Base, Morrison and Chen landed their F-22s and completed their post-flight procedures with unusual quietness. As they walked toward the debrief room, Morrison finally spoke. Did that actually just happen? Did we really intercept Ghost? Chen laughed, shaking her head in amazement. We did. And she complimented our flying. In the debrief, Their squadron commander listened to their account with growing astonishment. "You understand," he said slowly, "that you just escorted one of the finest tactical minds in the history of fighter aviation. Colonel Kane literally wrote portions of the F-22 tactical manual you both studied. Her combat innovations changed how we employ this aircraft." Morrison nodded, still processing. "Sir, she was traveling in economy, middle seat, looking like. I mean, no one would have known." The commander smiled. "That's who she is, Razor. True professionals don't need to advertise. They just do the work. Remember that as you continue your careers. The measure of a pilot isn't the medals or the recognition. It's the mission, the team, and the quiet knowledge that you served with honor." The story would be told and retold in fighter squadrons for years to come. The day two F-22 pilots intercepted a civilian airliner and discovered they'd been protecting a legend who needed no protection, who'd remained dignified and gracious even as passengers around her made assumptions based on nothing more than her modest appearance. It became a teaching moment about the dangers of superficial judgment, the importance of humility, and the reality that excellence often comes in unexpected packages. For Rebecca Kane, the incident was a brief interruption in a retirement she'd earned through 2 decades of extraordinary service. She eventually made it to Washington, D.C. for her originally scheduled reunion with old squadron mates. When she walked into the restaurant where they'd gathered, a dozen retired fighter pilots stood as one, their applause spontaneous and heartfelt. These were people who knew her worth, who'd flown with her, who understood the magnitude of what she'd accomplished. "So," one of them said with a grin, "I hear you had an interesting flight from Denver." Kane laughed, accepting a glass of wine and settling into a chair among friends. "It was educational," she said simply. "Reminded me why I loved flying with professionals. Those kids in the Raptors did excellent work." And in that moment, surrounded by people who knew her not as a legend but as a colleague and friend, Colonel Rebecca Kane was exactly where she belonged. Not in the spotlight, not seeking recognition, but among her tribe, the warriors who spoke a common language forged in speed and altitude and the absolute trust that came from shared danger overcome through shared excellence. The weeks following the incident brought unexpected ripples through the military aviation community. The 442nd Fighter Wing formally invited Kane to visit Whiteman Air Force Base, and she eventually accepted. Walking through the squadron ready room felt like stepping back in time. The familiar sound surrounded her, the crackle of radios, the smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid, the constant background noise of aircraft operations. Young pilots looked at her with a mixture of awe and curiosity, unsure how to approach someone whose reputation preceded her so dramatically. Morrison and Chen gave her a tour of their aircraft, and Kane climbed the ladder into an F-22 cockpit for the first time in years. The familiar layout greeted her like an old friend: multifunction displays, helmet-mounted cueing system, throttle and stick with their dozens of switches and buttons that she could have operated blindfolded even after years away. Her hands moved to the controls automatically, muscle memory from thousands of hours reasserting itself instantly. She ran her fingers over the throttle quadrant, feeling the texture of the grips, the placement of each switch exactly where her training had embedded them in her consciousness. "Feels like home, doesn't it?" Chen asked quietly, watching Kane's face as she reacquainted herself with the aircraft. Kane smiled, but there was sadness mixed with the joy. "It does. But this is your aircraft now, Captain. Yours and every other pilot in the current generation. My time in this seat is done. What matters now is that you take what we learned and push even further." She climbed down from the cockpit, and the squadron commander approached with a package wrapped in simple brown paper. "Colonel, the squadron wanted to present you with something," he said, genuine warmth in his voice. "We took the liberty of having this made." Kane unwrapped the package to find a custom flight suit, her name, tape and rank precisely placed, but with one meaningful addition: a squadron patch for the 442nd Fighter Wing, and below it, a simple tab that read, "Honorary Member." Her throat tightened unexpectedly. This meant more than any medal or formal recognition. This was acceptance from her tribe, acknowledgement from the people who truly understood what she'd accomplished and what it had cost. "I'm honored," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Truly honored. This means everything. The visit concluded with an informal gathering in the squadron bar, where pilots traded stories and asked questions. A young first lieutenant, fresh from the F-22 training pipeline, worked up the courage to approach her. "Ma'am," he said hesitantly, "everyone talks about your missions, but what I really want to know is, how did you handle the doubt? The people who said you didn't belong." Kane studied him for a moment, recognizing something in his uncertainty. "You want the truth, Lieutenant? I doubted myself every single day. Even after hundreds of missions, even after command. But I learned that doubt can be useful if you channel it correctly. It keeps you humble, keeps you training, keeps you sharp. The key is not letting it paralyze you. Use it as fuel to prepare better, to study harder, to refine your skills until you've earned your own confidence through performance, not arrogance." She paused, taking a sip of water. "As for the people who doubted me because of my gender, I made a choice early on. I could spend my energy fighting every skeptic with words, or I could let my flying do the talking. Excellence is the only answer that truly silences doubt. Not anger, not demands for respect, just consistent, undeniable excellence. Be so good at your job that the doubters are forced to confront their own prejudices through your performance." The young lieutenant nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Around them, other pilots had fallen silent, listening. These weren't just lessons about gender barriers, they were lessons about professionalism, about handling pressure, about maintaining standards in the face of scrutiny that applied to anyone trying to excel in an unforgiving profession. Morrison stood nearby, watching the interaction, and found himself reflecting on his own assumptions. He'd grown up in an air force where women in fighters were already established, but he realized now how much of that normalcy was built on the foundation Kane and others like her had laid through sheer force of competence and character. They'd absorbed the doubt, the skepticism, the extra scrutiny, and they'd answered with performance that couldn't be dismissed or diminished. As evening approached and the gathering wound down, Morrison walked Kane to her car. "Ma'am," he said, "I wanted to thank you. Not just for your service, though that would be enough. But for showing us what right looks like. That day over Kansas, when we discovered who you were, it reminded me that true professionals don't advertise their capabilities. They just perform when it matters." Kane looked at him thoughtfully. "Major, you already knew that. You proved it by conducting that intercept exactly the way it needed to be done, regardless of who was aboard. That's the standard. Not cutting corners, not getting complacent, treating every mission with the seriousness it deserves. Keep that mindset, pass it to the next generation, and this community will stay strong." She got into her car, but before driving away, she rolled down the window one last time. "And Major? Those 2 pilots you flew with that day, they were lucky to have someone as professional as you leading the formation. Keep setting that example. It matters more than you know." Morrison stood in the parking lot as her car disappeared into the distance, and he felt the weight of what she'd said. It wasn't about individual glory or recognition. It was about maintaining standards, about being part of something larger than yourself, about ensuring the next generation inherited an institution built on excellence rather than ego. Back in her quiet Colorado town, Kane settled back into retirement with renewed appreciation for both her past and her present. She still flew her Cessna over mountain ranges, still felt that perfect freedom that came with altitude and solitude. But now, occasionally, young pilots would reach out seeking mentorship, and she found herself saying yes more often than she'd expected. Not formal relationships, just conversations over coffee, advice offered when asked, the kind of quiet guidance that didn't require ceremony but could make all the difference to someone navigating the early stages of a challenging career. The incident aboard Flight 227 had pulled her briefly back into the spotlight she'd never sought, but it had also reminded her why she'd loved her service. Not the combat victories or the command positions or the decorations, though those had their place. What she'd loved was being part of a community dedicated to mastering difficult skills and employing them with precision and judgment. She'd loved the intellectual challenge of tactical problems, the physical thrill of pushing an aircraft to its limits, and the deep satisfaction of knowing her work mattered. One evening, months after the emergency landing, she received an unexpected package. Inside was a photograph, professionally framed, the grainy image of two F-22 Raptors in formation with a Boeing 757, captured by a passenger's phone from inside the airliner. Attached was a note in neat handwriting: "Colonel Kane, we had this framed for you as a reminder that legends sometimes fly in middle seats. Your example continues to inspire everyone in the 442nd. Respectfully, Razor and Viper." Kane hung the photograph in her study, where it joined other mementos from her career. Every time she looked at it, she was reminded of that strange day when her two worlds had collided, the quiet anonymity she preferred and the professional identity she'd built over decades of service. The image captured something essential about who she was and who she'd always been: someone content to do extraordinary things without demanding extraordinary recognition, someone who measured success not by public acclaim but by the quiet knowledge of work well done and standards upheld. The simple woman from Seat 23B had taught the world an important lesson that day over Kansas: that excellence doesn't require recognition, that professionalism transcends circumstances, and that the most extraordinary people often hide in plain sight, content to let their actions speak while they remain silent. And perhaps most importantly, that the measure of a person lies not in how they demand respect, but in how they earn it through consistent, undeniable competence and character.